The story of Jephthah's daughter, found in the biblical book of Judges, causes many who read it to recoil in horror. Jephthah was a mighty warrior in the days before a king ruled Israel. It was a time, according to the book, when everyone did what was right in their own eyes, when they would worship other gods and conduct themselves in ways contrary to the laws given to them by Moses. When the people found themselves in times of despair, which they often did, they cried out to Yahweh, the God of their fathers, who would raise up for them a champion, known as a judge, to rescue Israel from its troubles. Jephthah was such a man. When enemies threatened, Jephthah was called upon as a mighty warrior to defeat these foes. To secure his victory, he swore an oath to Yahweh that if he could be assured success over his enemies, he would sacrifice the first thing that came out of his house when he returned home from the battlefield. One could expect Jephthah believed a lamb or goat would come running to his side. Jephthah, under the power of Yahweh, was of course victorious, but when he arrived home, who should be the first to greet him but his one and only child, a daughter. In excruciating grief, Jephthah nonetheless stayed true to his word and sacrificed his only daughter, and the commemoration of her death became an annual memorial by the women of Israel for many years afterwards. Christians especially have a difficult time with this troublesome tale. Jephthah, in the New Testament book of Hebrews, is listed in its Faith Hall of Fame, grouped with others like Abraham, Jacob, Joseph, and Moses. How could a man who sacrificed his daughter to death be ranked among these other biblical luminaries? But does the Bible really tell the story of a human sacrifice? Did Jephthah, the champion chosen by God, offer up his only child on a blood-stained altar? Or is there something else going on here? What is the story of Jephthah's daughter? Funding for this program was provided in part by the generous contributions of viewers like you via Patreon. Consider joining them at www.patreon.com/Bible Skeptic. Thank you. The question of whether or not Jephthah really sacrificed his daughter did not seem to occur to early commentators of the text. Most, both Jewish and Christian, assumed a plain reading of the story, wherein Jephthah literally sacrificed his daughter to death. However, by the Middle Ages, some began to suggest that Jephthah may have instead dedicated his daughter to God in name only, so that she retained her life, but remained a virgin. While the concept of Jephthah's daughter being dedicated as a perpetual virgin was one that would not find wide support among biblical scholars through the years, a modern proposal has led to an ingenious and creative reassessment of the idea and a fresh approach to the text. In an examination of the Jephthah story made in 2002, author Pamela Reese takes a fresh look at the Jephthah story that may finally settle the question of whether Jephthah's daughter was really sacrificed as a burnt offering, as had been assumed by commentators of the text through the centuries, or if she only remained a perpetual virgin, forbidden from labor, including that of childbirth. As Reese points out, Israelites were taught by Abraham's intercepted sacrifice of Isaac that God does not desire such an offering, and human sacrifice is abhorred and denigrated throughout the Bible. Now we first hear of Jephthah in the book of Judges as a mighty man of valor. As such, he is called by the elders of Gilead to war with the Ammonites who have invaded the land. Jephthah successfully bargains with these elders to lead the men into battle. But before he does, he sends a message to the Ammonite king, reciting the historical events recorded in Numbers 20 through 21, justifying Israel's right to the land. Such astute negotiations and expert knowledge of Israel's history reflect for Reese the author of the story's own pro-Jephthah stance. But more so, Jephthah's great familiarity with the Old Testament text gives reason to believe he was fully aware that Israelite law forbade human sacrifice, as is noted in Deuteronomy 12. As further evidence of Jephthah's detailed knowledge of Scripture, he makes a pre-battle vow, the famous one which will seem to condemn his daughter when he returns from war. This vow of Jephthah's mirrors one given in Numbers 21, verse 2. So in other words, Jephthah's reiteration of the history of Numbers 20 through 21 is followed by a pre-battle vow, just as a pre-battle vow follows this same history in Numbers. The introductory clauses of the two vows are identical in all but the name of the enemy. Jephthah's vow is expressed astutely and is delivered in a manner well calculated. His intent, it seems, is to dedicate and redeem a slave in accordance with Leviticus 27 verses 1 through 8. Here, a person offered to Yahweh does not have to be sacrificed literally, as if they were a lamb or a dove, but they may be dedicated in name and a price paid to the priests in their stead. Rees argues that this dedicated person, once redeemed, can no longer do work. She states that the status of a dedicated and redeemed person is analogous to that of an animal that has been dedicated for sacrifice, but is instead redeemed with money or with a substitute animal. The once dedicated animal, even though redeemed, remains holy and may never be shorn or worked. In that sense, Rees does not think Jephthah had a woman in mind when he made his vow. More likely, he intended it to be a male slave. Women's work included childbearing, and were a woman to come out of Jephthah's house to greet him, she would have been required to remain celibate after her redemption, in order to ensure she would never labor with child. Jephthah's choice of words, "I will offer up for a burnt offering," therefore, must be interpreted metaphorically according to Rees. The literal meaning of the Hebrew word translated burnt offering does not necessarily indicate physical burning. The word itself is a metaphor, meaning to ascend. The same Hebrew word, olah, can refer to someone climbing stairs, as in 1 Kings 10:5. The sacrifice ascends, as if it were smoke into the heavens. So for Jephthah, whatever he had in mind to sacrifice would ascend to Yahweh, only in the sense of being a personal offering to God, who resides in heaven. It has also been noted that the vow would have had to have been made publicly so that others could hear it and testify to its fulfillment, or to call the vow maker to account should he not hold up his end of the bargain. It was a matter of honor. And that's just the sense we get from a closer reading of the text. It appears Jephthah made his vow in Mizpah, his hometown. If so, his entire household would have been aware of its terms. Uttered privately, such a vow would have had no value or impact, and gained him no honor in the eyes of others. Even if his family were not in the gathering that witnessed it, word of such a dramatic vow would doubtless have reached them, while Jephthah was smiting the Ammonites. Given that the vow was uttered publicly, and regardless of Jephthah's intention to whom it would be applied, his daughter seems to know the full terms of the vow when she comes out of the house to greet him upon his return from battle. Male commentators have long admired what they saw as typical feminine traits in Jephthah's daughter: intuition, resignation, while women analysts portrayed her as a saint, martyred by patriarchal oppression. For Rees's fresh approach to the text, however, Jephthah's daughter, in full knowledge of the vow, willfully chooses her own future, not death, but celibacy. She is, in truth, a self-determining individual. She is now free to stay at home, unmarried in her father's house, to be doted upon and taken care of the rest of her life. Nonetheless, Jephthah's daughter recognizes the strife she's caused her father and requests he allow her 2 months to spend in the mountains with her friends before he fulfills his vow. His reaction to her self-actualizing decision to remain his little girl forever and stay with him in his household has caught her by surprise. She must now bewail her virginity as a concession to her father's unexpectedly negative reaction. The text states, however, that the girl goes down on the mountains. One cannot physically go down on mountains. One goes up to mountains. The strange use of the word here, according to Rees, alerts the reader that the word is being employed in a spiritual, not a physical sense. The direction down is used throughout Scripture to signal a spiritual descent. Whatever Jephthah's daughter wants to do on the mountains, it will be done on a lower spiritual level than obtains in her father's house. Rees believes Jephthah's daughter wants to go down to weep before other gods, perhaps with the hope that these other deities will help undo the damage to her father. Once his daughter returns from her activities down the mountains, the text records that Jephthah did with her according to the vow that he had vowed. For Rees, this means that Jephthah, heartsick that as a burnt offering she cannot know the fulfillment of marriage and children, he redeems his daughter with the appropriate fees and fulfills the conditions of his vow. The story concludes noting that each year the young women of Israel spend 4 days commemorating the daughter of Jephthah. Most commentators have understood this to mean that the women spent the 4 days in mourning, but Rees sees this differently. Rees believes the women of Israel assembled monthly for idolatrous worship, just as Jephthah's daughter did down the mountain, probably in connection with the moon, celebrating her choice of independence and self-determination. Nonetheless, 3 punishments are recorded for this disastrous chain of events caused by Jephthah's erroneous vow. With his daughter now a perpetual virgin, Jephthah's family line is extinguished. His reign is shorter than that of any other judge, except for Abimelech, and his burial is rather disgraceful in that his body seemed to have been scattered throughout the cities of Gilead. In Rees's analysis, we are meant to learn a lesson from Jephthah's tragedy, namely the wages of parental overindulgence. Excessive permissiveness and lack of parental discipline led Jephthah to make what would prove to be a historical mistake. According to Rees, her analysis adheres more closely to the plain surface meaning of the text than does the more common reading in which Jephthah literally sacrifices his daughter to death. Her analysis does not depend on intuition, missing verses, or mistranslation, she says. She brings Jephthah's daughter down to earth on the solid ground of undoctored textual evidence that frees her from passivity's bonds. Rees demonstrates that far from powerless, Jephthah's daughter manipulates her father, gets him to permit her even what is most offensive and ultimately ruinous to him, and secures for herself a life of comfortable independence. The daughters of Israel do indeed have something to celebrate at the conclusion of the story. Pamela Rees is not a Bible scholar. In the introduction to her book, Reading the Lines, A Fresh Look at the Hebrew Bible, in which she advances her analysis of the Jephthah story, she readily admits she has no mastery of Hebrew, no background in biblical studies, and no ticket stamped Ph.D. Upon closer inspection of Rees's so-called analysis of the story of Jephthah, these shortcomings become glaringly obvious. While Rees claimed her study does not depend on intuition, missing verses, or mistranslation, it actually does just that. Rees's reading of the text is driven by personal motivations and a strange flair for reading the minds of biblical characters. Her intuition tells her that Jephthah's daughter runs out to greet her father upon his return from the Ammonite battle, having full knowledge of his vow to sacrifice the first thing that comes out of his home to greet him, because she chooses, on at least a subconscious level, to remain unmarried. She would rather defy convention and continue to be the one and only love of an extremely indulgent father. None of this is present in the text of Judges, of course, but is born from Rees's own fruitful imagination. She further intuits, perhaps she hopes that Jephthah will welcome the sight of her upon his return from war, and that he will rejoice in the marriage prohibition attendant on the vow, knowing that his little girl can now never leave him. In Rees's vision, Jephthah's daughter is a spoiled child who does whatever she wants to do. Further digging into a motivation for the daughter's actions, Rees notes that the text indicates Jephthah's mother was a zanah, and references a study suggesting that this Hebrew word does not necessarily mean prostitute or harlot as it is translated in most modern English Bibles, but could instead refer to a self-supporting woman who prefers to live independently. In this way, Rees envisions Jephthah's daughter as inheriting these traits from her grandmother, preferring emancipation and affluence over marriage and dependence. Rees notes that Jephthah is a man of means, and now high standing. Life with father would be quite comfortable. Be that as it may, how is a person who is barred from doing any work and resigned to living out her life in her father's house, asserting independence? What was she to do once her father died? Who would take care of her, since she had no other family, and could do no labor to support herself in Rees's scenario? If she were an early adolescent at the time, which is likely since if she were older she would have already been married, she may not even have been 20 years old at Jephthah's death, 6 years after this event. Assuming she lived another 20 years or more, since she would not have worried about dying in childbirth given Rees's reading of the text, who took care of her? According to Judges, Ibzan of Bethlehem led Israel following Jephthah's death. It was not customary in the ancient world for a new ruling family to take on the responsibility for caring for the previous ruler's family. Who would have wanted to take on the burden of caring for Jephthah's daughter? Indeed, her choice is anything but asserting independence, but would be instead committing oneself to a lifetime of dependence, or worse. Additionally, the Hebrew word zanah is used elsewhere in Scripture, and in these contexts seems always to indicate a woman of questionable scruples. For example, in Judges 16 we read of Samson's visit to a zanah, where he stays with her until midnight. Then went Samson to Gaza, and saw there a zanah, and went in unto her. English translations have this woman as a harlot, and it is doubtful Samson went into this woman looking for financial advice. And Proverbs 7 speaks of a woman who comes out at dusk and waits on street corners, describing her as a woman with the attire of a zanah, who says she has decked my bed with coverings of tapestry, with carved works, with fine linen of Egypt, and perfumed my bed with myrrh, aloes, and cinnamon. She offers potential suitors to come with her and take our fill of love until the morning. Now, while not every self-supporting woman who prefers to live independently is a prostitute, certainly most prostitutes are indeed self-supporting women. There certainly is no reason other than the agenda of an apologist to assume Jephthah's mother was not herself, as the text states, a zanah, a prostitute. It is why his half-brothers cast him from their home, stating, "You are not going to get any inheritance in our family." But why make these assumptions about a biblical character's motivations? The text devotes merely 6 verses to anything Jephthah's daughter does or says, and none of it tells us about her motivations or her relationship with her father. Nonetheless, Rees has developed an entire psychological profile of the girl. Rees hasn't simply looked at a plain surface meaning of the text, but has instead inserted herself into the story. She notes regarding her imagined motivation for the daughter's actions, "I could certainly understand that childish logic, having been the spoiled daughter of an indulgent father myself." Hers is an introspective, 21st century feminist interpretation of the text, empowering an otherwise passive female character in the story, modeled after her own life and experiences. Instead of a victim, Rees has created a body double, in her words, a self-determining individual. This, of course, raises the question, would Rees have psychoanalyzed the characters differently and invented an alternative interpretation of the text had she been the victim of an abusive father rather than an indulgent one? How might she have approached the story if she'd been adopted or the child of a single mother without a paternal presence? This isn't meant to actually explore such possibilities, but to highlight the absurdity of trying to interpret the biblical text through the filter of one's own personal history. Another problem with Rees's reading of the text is that Jephthah isn't nearly the scholar of Israelite history as she would have her readers believe. She had argued that Jephthah was a clever man, a learned diplomat, and possessing a detailed knowledge of Israelite history in his reference to the events of Numbers 20 and 21. But Kenneth Kitchen, Personal and Brunner Professor Emeritus of Egyptology and Honorary Research Fellow at the School of Archaeology, Classics, and Oriental Studies, University of Liverpool, has noted a terrible gaffe in Jephthah's boasting to the Ammonite king of Israel's occupation of the land east of the Jordan. Jephthah is narrated in Judges 11:26 as saying, "For 300 years Israel occupied Heshbon, Aroer, the surrounding settlements, and all the towns along the Arnon." However, if we take the Bible's own chronology seriously, Jephthah would have become judge in either 1268 BCE or 1073, depending on how one does the biblical calculations. According to Kitchen, then, Jephthah's reckoning would place that occupation at about the year 1370, which in itself makes no sense whatsoever on any current date of the Exodus 40 years before, whether in 1447 or 1260, 1250, or any time in between. Contrary to Rees's assessment of the historical wisdom of Jephthah, Kitchen concludes, "Brave fellow that he was, Jephthah was a roughneck, an outcast, and not exactly the kind of man who would scruple first to take a PhD in local chronology at some ancient university of the Yarmouk before making strident claims to the Ammonite ruler. What we have is nothing more than a report of a brave but ignorant man's bold bluster in favor of his people, not a mathematically precise chronological datum." Additionally, Jephthah blunders in his bargaining with the Ammonite king, referencing Israel's right to the land by stating, "Since the Lord, the God of Israel, has driven the Amorites out before his people Israel, what right have you to take it over?" Will you not take what your god Chemosh gives you? Likewise, whatever the Lord our God has given us, we will possess. The problem here for Jephthah, the master negotiator and apparent scholar, is that Chemosh is a Moabite deity, not Ammonite. This would be akin to confusing Yahweh with Zeus. Apparently, whether Jephthah was a clever man or not, he wasn't very bright. Another problem with Rees's assumptions involved Jephthah's vow. The text does not say whether the vow was made privately or publicly, but for Rees's purposes, it had to have been done in such a way as to have made it back for his daughter to hear. But if one insists the vow had to have been made publicly, whether to accrue honor and social standing or just by accident, why must Jephthah's daughter have been a spoiled brat to come out to greet her father on his return from battle in order to fulfill her selfish desire to remain celibate and in her daddy's home? Perhaps she had a far more noble and complex character than apologists like Rees are willing to afford her. If we're going to surmise motive and read biblical characters' subconscious minds, yet maintain the assertion that the young woman was a self-determining individual, perhaps the reason she assured she was the first to greet her father upon his return from battle was to take the place of an intended slave. Perhaps she saw the injustice in allowing another to die for her father's foolish vow, and took that responsibility upon herself, a martyr in the truest sense. There is just as much textual evidence to support such a psychoanalysis as there is to support Rees's. As a matter of fact, Jephthah's sacrifice is not the only such story from the ancient world, and it is not lost on many scholars the similarities between the Jephthah story and that of Iphigenia, the daughter of Sparta's king Agamemnon. Is it possible this ancient Greek tale of tragedy informed and influenced the author of the story of Jephthah? Instead of a manipulative, spoiled brat, might she have instead accepted her fate nobly, as did Iphigenia? After having run afoul of the goddess Artemis, Agamemnon was forced to sacrifice his most beloved daughter in order for his army and fleet of ships to join the rest of the Greek coalition in its battle against Troy. At first horrified, Iphigenia soon accepted her fate and turned her desire to live into courage and resolve. As retold by the playwright Euripides, Iphigenia turned to her bereft mother, Clytemnestra, and reshaped her death as a sacrifice on behalf of Greece. Listen, mother, to what I have been thinking. I have decided to die. I want to do this gloriously by yielding and doing away with my low-mindedness. Come, mother, look at it with my eyes and see how nobly I speak. All of majestic Greece looks upon me now. It is through me that the ships will be able to sail and the Trojans will find their grave. And if barbarians do something to women in the future, it is through me that they will be prevented from seizing them from happy Greece. All this I will secure by dying, and mine will be the blissful glory that I brought Greece's freedom. I offer my body for Greece. Sacrifice me and destroy Troy. That will be my monument for ages to come. That will be my children, my husband, my glory. Iphigenia's death not only appeased the anger of the goddess Artemis, but as a willing and noble sacrificial victim, she underwent a death that had more potency and power. In accepting her fate, she became a liberator of her country and a crucial part of the destruction of Troy. For this, she was remembered and praised, just as Jephthah's daughter was memorialized by the women of Israel. But the truth is, we needn't psychoanalyze biblical characters at all to understand why Jephthah's daughter may have been the first to greet him. 1 Samuel 18:6 describes the common practice of joyful women coming out of towns to dance and sing the praises of returning warriors. Jephthah's daughter was simply engaging in this very practice. Whether she knew of her father's vow or not is something the text doesn't tell us, and so psychoanalyzing her motivation to be the first to greet her father is a fool's errand. Furthermore, Rees insists that the traditional reading of verse 39 of Judges 11 has been wrong all along, and that a proper interpretation of the text actually supports her claim that perpetual virginity was required for any woman redeemed from a vow of dedication. The "it" in the verse actually refers to the obligatory virginity mentioned in the preceding clause. As Rees interprets the text, he did with her according to his vow, which he had vowed, and she did not know a man, for it was a statute in Israel. And thus the whole verse apparently confirms her reading that Jephthah's daughter is now prohibited the labor of childbirth. Verse 39 therefore tells us that there is a statute imposing work restriction on redeemed women. And yet, aside from Rees's interpretation of this single verse, no such statute does exist anywhere in Scripture that she or any other apologist can find. The traditional reading of this verse must include verse 40. Verses and chapters are artificial constructs imposed on the text. The text was not originally written with such divisions. As such, the translated Hebrew without the artificial divisions reads, "And it came to pass at the end of 2 months that she returned unto her father, who did with her according to his vow which he had vowed, and she knew no man. And it was a custom in Israel that the daughters of Israel went yearly to lament the daughter of Jephthah the Gileadite 4 days in a year." So the custom in Israel was not that she knew no man, nor should anyone else similarly dedicated and redeemed, but that the custom in Israel was for women to mark the occasion of Jephthah's fulfillment of his vow and his daughter's sacrifice. Moreover, Rees's analysis of the text, stating that when Jephthah's daughter goes down on the mountains, that the word is being employed in a spiritual, not a physical sense, is extraordinarily convoluted and misplaced. Jephthah's hometown of Mizpah was located in the hills of Judea. When his daughter says she's going down on the mountains with her friends to mourn her virginity, she is simply saying she is going down from home. It's unfortunate for Rees that psychoanalyzing biblical characters as if they were guests on a daytime TV talk show is not the way to properly understand the text. But even if we were to provisionally accept Rees's assertions about the text, how does an overindulgent father and spoiled brat daughter fit the larger context of the book of Judges? Rees is operating under the impression that these stories are historical narratives, dryly recounting historical events on paper the way a recorder does on tape, a camera does on film, or video does digitally. This is what allows her the freedom to climb into the characters' minds and psychoanalyze them. However, these stories, even if based loosely on historical figures, are not history in the way the modern reader understands history. While Rees claims her analysis of the text adheres more closely to the plain surface meaning of the text, it is just this surface reading that dooms her conclusions, as is her belief that somehow they reflect her own experiences as the spoiled child of an overindulgent father. The study of the past should help us understand that we are part of a larger human narrative that is much bigger than just ourselves. As the historian Weinberg points out, for the narcissist sees the world, both the past and the present, in his own image. Mature historical understanding teaches us to do the opposite, to go beyond our own image, to go beyond our brief life, and to go beyond the fleeting moment in human history into which we have been born. The tale of Jephthah is a narrative in a much, much larger creation, carefully crafted by its author to tell a particular story. One simply cannot divorce Jephthah and his daughter from this larger context, and it is to this larger context we now turn. There are far better ways to understand a biblical story than isolating it and psychoanalyzing its characters. The tale of Jephthah and his daughter is found in the larger context of the book of Judges, which itself is part of an even larger work. Scholars for decades have studied the biblical texts and have uncovered how it was composed, written, and edited into its current form. Outside evangelical circles, most scholars agree that many authors and many centuries were involved in the development of the various books of the Bible. Sources have been identified, and a general history of the writing and editing of the text has been developed. While time does not afford us the luxury of an in-depth study of these sources and how they were identified by scholars here, we should take the time to briefly review what is known as the documentary hypothesis. In its most basic form, the documentary hypothesis claims that 4 sources are responsible for the majority of the text in the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, and including Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and the books of 1st and 2nd Kings. These sources are referred to as J, E, D, and P. In addition to these sources, there is evidence of redactional material as well, used to knit these various sources into the whole that we find in our Bibles today. Evangelicals reject this theory, believing instead that Moses himself wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, with other authors contributing the remainder of the material. While the documentary hypothesis is hotly debated in its details, no serious scholar doubts its basic precepts, that the Bible is composed of sources of varying ages and various authors, brought together at a much later time, and it is in this context that we must understand the story of Jephthah. However, for Pamela Reese, the documentary hypothesis was a rejected idea when composing her analysis of the Jephthah story. Following on the heels of reading herself as the daughter of an overindulgent father into her examination of the tale, she rejected the documentary hypothesis, not because she could find scholarly fault with it, but because it didn't fit her family profile. She wrote, "There goes the fun, I thought, when I learned of the nearly universal multiple author doctrine. What interest or amusement could there be in resolving a problem passage when it could be easier and perhaps more accurate to decree that the troublesome verses were written by authors with divergent agendas, and were slapped together willy-nilly by inattentive or obsessive redactors? This critical bandwagon was not for me, no matter how many learned scholars were on it. I did not know whether my father and his orthodox teachers were right, or if the source critics were right, but I chose to be biased in favor of my father's opinion, partly to honor his memory — he had died when I was 25, but mostly because I resented the killjoy convictions of the documentary hypothesists." It's a shame Reese believes the documentary hypothesis asserts the sources found in the Bible were slapped together willy-nilly by inattentive or obsessive redactors, as this is hardly the case. Scholars studying the historical composition of the biblical text and its myriad sources see instead a rich and intricately woven fabric of writing and editing, telling an epic tale of an ancient people. Far from killing the joy of reading and understanding the text, the documentary hypothesis helps bring a deeper understanding to the Bible in its dizzyingly complicated composition. In regards to the book of Judges, in which we find the Jephthah story, scholars of the documentary hypothesis state that it is part of a larger work which begins with Deuteronomy and continues through the next 6 books. As a hypothesis, scholars believe that the traditions of Israel assembled in these books constituted a literary work which brought together material from highly varied traditions and arranged it according to a carefully conceived plan. Whatever these traditions were, and whatever form they may have taken, oral or written, they are now an integral part of the whole work and no longer recoverable. This larger work, as we have it today, however, is known as the Deuteronomistic History. It is generally believed to have been composed in its original form during the reign of King Josiah, around 622 BCE. Indeed, Josiah figures prominently in the history. The work covers the period from Moses to the end of the kingdom, but it is a history told from a decidedly religious perspective. It is not the sort of history one would expect to find in a 21st century textbook. The Deuteronomist, as the author or group of authors responsible for the work is called, constructed his narrative so that the laws of Deuteronomy would stand as the foundation of the history. When he rated the kings of Israel and Judah as good in the eyes of Yahweh or bad in the eyes of Yahweh, it was according to how obedient they were to Deuteronomy's laws. He characterized the entire fate of the nation as hanging upon how well they kept the commandments. As a proponent of Josiah, the writer rates every one of the kings below him. He rates Josiah, and Josiah alone, as unequivocally good. As far as the author's intention for composing the book of Judges, one must keep in mind that the Deuteronomistic historian believed the people's destiny in the land depended on how carefully they observed the laws of Moses. The insertion at the beginning of the book of Judges says that the people often failed to follow Yahweh, and they would turn to other gods. The author is setting his theme for the book to follow. For the Deuteronomistic historian writing with the notion that an ideal monarchy was required to keep the nation in line with the Mosaic laws, he composed the book of Judges in such a way that it portrays Israel with ineffective leadership, completely unable to keep the people out of the grips of foreign oppression and apostasy. Judges presents story after story of miserable conquest, followed by repeated infidelity and evil, as well as oppression and deliverance, with a steady decline in which the strong constantly overpowered the weak. Judges has a greater rhetorical purpose other than the mere recitation of the chaotic period of the Judges. Some scholars believe the book of Judges may have circulated as a piece of pro-Davidic and anti-Saulite propaganda before it was finally incorporated into the larger Deuteronomistic history at the time of Josiah. Whether pro-Davidic or pro-Josiah, it presents an anarchic social situation that only the establishment of a monarchy dedicated to the laws of Moses could overcome. For the Deuteronomistic historian, this steady decline throughout the book of Judges reaches its climax in the story of Jephthah. As we will see shortly, Jephthah is not raised up as a deliverer by Yahweh. He is summoned by the elders of Gilead, and he comes only after he has struck a political bargain with them. The Jephthah story then ends with two unmitigated disasters, one personal and the other for Israelite society as a whole. On a personal level, Jephthah loses his daughter through a wholly unnecessary sacrifice. For the nation, there is a rupture with Ephraim, leading to war and bloodshed. Regardless of whether one accepts the proposal of the documentary hypothesis or not, Judges nonetheless has a clear and unmistakable recurrently cyclical theme of infidelity followed by oppression and repentance, forgiveness and restoration. Israel is in a state of decline with apostasy and ineffectual leadership. A spoiled daughter with an indulgent father with nonetheless unimpeachable faith simply does not fit with this theme. The author's intent is to convince readers of the failure of the judges and the need for a monarchy which focuses squarely on Yahweh and the laws of Moses. The Christian apologist, instead of trying to understand and situate the Jephthah story within this larger context of the book of Judges, tries to fit it into the theme of the New Testament book of Hebrews. This is why their approaches so often fail. Because Hebrew lists Jephthah in its roll call of those figures from Israelite history said to have exhibited profound faith, and holds up Jephthah as a pious example Christians should follow, Christian apologists have been bedeviled to come up with a solution for the Jephthah story that does not involve the ritual slaughter of his only child in the name of Yahweh. But for those of us unfettered by such restrictive beliefs, how can we read the story within its original context in the book of Judges? Keeping in mind the author's choice to portray Israel as disintegrating into apostasy with each passing judge, pointing the way to a divinely sanctioned monarchy and ultimately to the rulership of Josiah, the story of Jephthah takes on a completely different complexion than that imagined by the evangelical apologist. So just how does this tale of a so-called man of valor who rises to judge Israel but nonetheless sacrifices his daughter as a burnt offering to Yahweh fit with the theme of the book of Judges? As the Deuteronomist weaves his narrative through the book, it is hard to miss that the 6 major judges of his story become progressively less effective and less faithful, while at the same time Israel's acts become more evil. His theme here is of an ever-increasing disintegration of the nation, leading up to the establishment of the Davidic monarchy. For example, Gideon, the judge before Jephthah, not only has difficulty believing that Yahweh can deliver Israel and continuously demands signs from the deity before he fulfills his commands, he ultimately causes Israel to fall into idolatry, while Samson, the judge following Jephthah, arranges a marriage with a Philistine woman, has sex with a Philistine prostitute, and falls in love with a Philistine woman. Samson does these deeds even though Deuteronomy expressly prohibits intermarriage with the people of Canaan, because, in the Deuteronomistic worldview, this leads to apostasy. The sacrifice of Jephthah's daughter fits perfectly with this thematic decline of Israel and her so-called saviors in the book of Judges. The Deuteronomist tells the story of Jephthah's sacrifice of his daughter primarily to show that foreign sacrifice will accompany the exercise of foreign morality should Israel take up the ways of her neighbors. Jephthah's story illustrates probably the most important theological motive of Judges. When Israel worships like foreigners, it will act like foreigners. Jephthah's narrative also fits well into another important motive of the book, the decline of Israel and its judges, leading ultimately to the united monarchy of King David and the proper worship of Yahweh. The opening of the Jephthah story begins with a long list of foreign gods whom Israel has worshipped. It is the longest of such lists in the book of Judges, highlighting just how far from Yahweh the people have fallen. It is clear from such a list that Israel no longer worships just the Baals and Asherahs. It worships the gods of all the surrounding nations. As a result, Israel has fallen into sin and is being punished by foreign occupation. Yahweh now refuses to rescue the nation from its current plight. The Deuteronomist writes in 10:16 what is commonly translated from the Hebrew as, Yahweh could no longer bear to see Israel suffer. However, when the Hebrew verb katser, translated here as bear or grieved, is used to express emotion, it expresses exasperation. Katser has the root meaning of be short and can be used in the sense of be tired of, impatient with, or discouraged. Nowhere in Scripture does it mean to be sorry for or to show compassion. But it makes little sense to say that Yahweh became impatient with the misery or suffering of Israel. The Hebrew word here used is amal, and instead has the sense of evil, as it does in Proverbs 24:2. Yahweh's reaction to Israel's cry is not to feel sorry for it and moved to compassion, but to become exasperated with the continual evil of the nation's apostasy. Since Yahweh has turned a deaf ear to the cries of his people, they take matters into their own hands. The Deuteronomist writes that the elders of Gilead, a region east of the Jordan River, assembled and camped at Mizpah, Jephthah's hometown. Here they begged Jephthah to lead them into battle against the Ammonites who were oppressing them. In return, they offered Jephthah leadership over all who lived in Gilead. Jephthah accepted the offer, but only after the elders promised not to go back on their word. Unlike previous judges in the narrative, Jephthah here is not called by Yahweh, but is bribed into leadership. Once in command of the armed forces, instead of leading his men into battle against the Ammonites, Jephthah begins negotiations with the Ammonite king. Far from showing shrewdness or cunning or diplomacy, Jephthah's bargaining with the Ammonites show just how far the so-called leadership of Israel has tumbled. Why would a judge negotiate with an invader? It is the only story in the book where an Israelite judge negotiates with a foreign state. However, when placed in the context of the Deuteronomistic history and the theme of judges, the inclusion of this part of the story makes perfect sense. Here, the author is creating a context wherein Jephthah may call upon Yahweh as a judge to decide the issue of whether Israel or Ammon is entitled to the Transjordan. What this will lead to is Jephthah's so-called errant vow, in which he promises to sacrifice the first thing that greets him upon his return from battle, if Yahweh fulfills his own promise to deliver the Ammonites into his hand. If Jephthah was such a mighty warrior and scholar of Israel's history, as some may think, why did he feel compelled to bargain with Yahweh to uphold his end of the deal to expel the Ammonites, as if there was any doubt God would do what he said he would do? What Jephthah in effect does in the narrative of the Deuteronomist is make his vow an act of attempted bribery. The author is hearkening back to his own written law codes of the book of Deuteronomy, which expressly prohibits the bribing of judges, and also states that Yahweh himself cannot be bribed. The Deuteronomist also uses the vow to foreshadow Jephthah's commitment to carry out the sacrifice of his daughter. He shares the common ancient Near Eastern idea that vows must be fulfilled or else disaster will strike the one who swore it. One need only refer to Deuteronomy 23 verses 21 through 23 as an example. As for the content of the vow itself, it has been suggested that Jephthah was not promising to make a literal burnt offering by appealing to a metaphoric sense of the Hebrew word olah found in the text of his vow. Of course, such a suggestion is made ignorant of the actual context of the Jephthah story and how it fits the Deuteronomist's theme of judges. The claim is that the word olah is itself a metaphor, which refers to something ascending. Some point to 1 Kings 10:5 or Ezekiel 40:26, where olah is used and translated to reference someone literally ascending a flight of steps. If thought of in this sense, olah would refer to a sacrifice ascending towards heaven and the abode of Yahweh as smoke. But of course, it is pointed out, there are more ways to ascend than as feet upon steps, or as ashes or smoke into the air. If olah is to be understood metaphorically, then a human who ascends as a sacrifice does so as one merely set apart from the rest of the world as holy. In this sense, some see Jephthah's vow to offer the first thing that greets him upon his return from battle as offered to Yahweh ascending to the deity only in a metaphorical and spiritual sense. Olah is used over 570 times in the Hebrew Scriptures according to the New American Standard Bible Concordance, and its meaning can be almost universally understood from its use in context. The trouble with the apologetic used to explain away Jephthah's sacrifice of his daughter as merely a metaphor is that when olah is used in the context of an offering, it is never used in a metaphorical or merely spiritual sense. For example, what are we to believe Noah did in Genesis 8:20? Did he send up a metaphorical offering? or were metaphors offered by Joshua on Mount Elba on the altar he built according to what was written in the book of the law of Moses in Joshua 8:31. Such offerings are referenced 34 times in the Deuteronomistic History alone, and there it is always in reference to a literal burnt offering, with the single possible exception of 1 Kings 10:5. As the NASB translates the passage, when the Queen of Sheba perceived all the wisdom of Solomon, the house that he had built, the food of his table, the seating of his servants, the attendance of his waiters in their attire, his cupbearers, and his stairway by which he went up to the house of the Lord, there was no more spirit in her. It's a little odd to marvel at a stairway, but it is certainly possible. However, even in this context, Ola could still be in reference to burnt offerings. As the NIV translates the passage, when the Queen of Sheba saw all the wisdom of Solomon and the palace he had built, the food on his table, the seating of his officials, the attending servants in their robes, his cupbearers, and the burnt offerings he made at the temple of the Lord, she was overwhelmed. This is the same translation of Ola found also in the ESV, JPS Tanakh, and Young's literal translation. We can take this a step further and note that if the author's intent was to refer to steps, as in the NASB, there was actually a better Hebrew word found elsewhere in the Deuteronomistic History, Me Allah. It is found twice, for example, only 14 verses later in 1 Kings 10:19 and 20, when describing Solomon's throne. The throne had 6 steps. There was a rounded top at the back of the throne, armrests on either side of the seat, and 2 lions standing beside the armrests. 12 lions were standing there on the 6 steps, one at each end. Nothing like it had ever been made in any other kingdom. So in all likelihood, even in 1 Kings 10:5, Ola was probably intended to refer to literal burnt offerings, which could certainly impress a foreign queen more so than a handful of steps. There simply is nothing in the Jephthah story, or anywhere else in the Deuteronomistic history, to suggest the author meant to use the term Ola metaphorically. As for how the vow was uttered, nothing in the text tells us if it was done privately or in public. The reason some apologists believe it must have been made publicly is because the daughter virtually repeats the vow verbatim to Jephthah upon his return to their home. However, there is no more reason to believe Jephthah's daughter overheard the vow and repeated it with near Memorex-like precision than it is to believe the vow wasn't simply given before the men of Gilead alone, and not in front of the entire countryside, from burning bush to lowly housefly. The daughter knows the vow because the author knows the vow. The voice of the daughter is the voice of the author, reminding the reader of what had been uttered. These stories were not originally read from books, with individuals able to turn back pages to recall what had come before. They were read aloud, and these sort of recall techniques in the text were common. They are not word-for-word recordings of what actually took place on a single day sometime in the distant past. When the narrative brings the daughter from the house to greet her father upon his return from the Ammonite battle, the author is keeping her actions in line with his overall theme of Judges. When confronted with what she has forced Jephthah to do, namely to offer her as a sacrificial burnt offering, she does not resist. In accepting her fate and reminding her father of his vow, she collaborates in her own death because she accepts the same foreign assumptions about sacrifice that her father does, regardless of how faithful he is being to his vow. Both should know that human sacrifice is abhorrent to Yahweh, but both have fallen away from a true worship of God, having been influenced by the pantheon of Canaanite deities listed in 10:6, just as has all of Israel. In other words, even though worshippers of Yahweh, the author has painted the people as worshiping through the influence of these foreign gods, which corrupts even the best of intentions. The sin of the nation has grown exponentially worse. This is the price Israel pays for going its own way without proper Yahweh-focused leadership, as will be introduced by the Davidic monarchy, and reach its height with Josiah. While complicit in her own pending sacrifice, Jephthah's daughter nonetheless requests a 2-month reprievement from the fulfillment of the act. However, if, as the Apologist asserts, the girl had deliberately manipulated her father into dedicating her to perpetual virginity, it is hardly natural to take bewailing one's virginity to mean bewailing the fact that one has to remain so. Instead, reading the daughter's request within the context of the Deuteronomist's theme of Judges, the author wished to express the fact that she would die a virgin. If she was merely to remain a virgin, why would she wish to spend 2 months wandering the hill country bewailing her fate, a fate she apparently designed for herself, according to the Apologist? She had the rest of her life to come to terms with her perpetual virginity if, in fact, she was having second thoughts. However, postponing her death by 2 months makes far more sense in the true context of the story. But why, some may ask, does the story take pains to state in Judges 11:39 that she had never slept with a man? The author likely added this to stress the pathos of her fate. She died without ever having known a man, which was an additional consequence and cruelty to her death. In 21st century Western society, where life for its own sake is valued, no such concept existed in biblical Israel. Value was placed instead on the role one played in the larger context of the household, clan, or state. In the context of the Jephthah story, his daughter was the only means by which his house would gain a proper heir, either through a son or a son-in-law. So the daughter's and her friend's bewailment of her virginity cannot be used as an unambiguous marker to suppose she was merely going to remain a perpetual virgin. The sorrow instead was over the loss of her role in the family system. We cannot allow our modern concepts over the value of an individual's life to color how we read the story. The Bible certainly is not like the Jerry Springer Show, in which sordid stories of individuals is the focus for titillating voyeurism. Now, if the vow was merely to dedicate Jephthah's daughter to Yahweh metaphorically, in a spiritual sense, why was this not instead a moment of great pride and joy for Jephthah? What better way to repay the faithfulness of Yahweh in his victory over the Ammonites, and more, his rise from a rejected son of a harlot to the prince of the people? Is having a child serve Yahweh such a horrific thing that it would cause one to tear one's clothes in grief? In addition, the honor afforded to Jephthah to publicly demonstrate his faithfulness to the God who delivered his people from their enemy and his faithfulness to his own vow would not have been a moment of anguish, but of great pride and honor. When the author states that the daughter became a statute in Israel, writing, 4 days every year the daughters of Israel go out to recount the daughter of Jephthah the Gileadite, it is critical to keep in mind that he has stressed throughout his work the need for proper and acceptable modes of worship. Israel should not worship Yahweh in the ways the Canaanites worship their gods. Jephthah, however, makes a foreign sacrifice, and when the women of Israel create a festival that memorializes the willingness of the human victim to take part in it, we find the nation acting like foreigners along with him. Israel itself has adopted foreign morality and modes of worship. The verse has nothing to do with establishing virginity as a statute to follow for women dedicated to Yahweh under the rules of Leviticus, as was suggested in Rees's analysis, a statute found nowhere in Scripture or Jewish practice. But the story of Jephthah does not conclude with the sacrifice of his daughter. The Deuteronomist's story of the depravity of the judge and of Israel is not finished. This wrong or foreign sacrifice is immediately followed by the story of an Israelite tribe attempting to do what the foreign Ammonite nation earlier in the Jephthah story does, annex land that God had not given to them. In chapter 12, verses 1 through 6, we read of a battle between the tribes of Gilead and Ephraim. The men of Ephraim are angry that Jephthah had not called on them to battle with the Ammonites, and they try to attack Jephthah and his fellow Gileadites. Jephthah and his men are victorious, however, and capture the fords of the Jordan leading to Ephraim. The narrative reads that whenever a survivor of Ephraim said, "Let me cross over," the men of Gilead asked him to say a particular word to detect any survivors, knowing that the Ephraimites pronounced it slightly differently in their dialect. If he could not pronounce the word correctly, the Gileadites seized him and killed him. The text, reminiscent of an Elisha story, states that 42,000 Ephraimites were killed during this national tragedy, just as 42 children died when Elisha called 2 she-bears to avenge his wounded pride. The figure 42 apparently was a dark omen for the Deuteronomistic writer. The tale of the Ephraimite invasion of Gilead was included to further underscore the Deuteronomistic theme in Judges that when Israel worships like foreigners, it will act like foreigners. The inclusion of the different accents is a way for the Deuteronomist to portray the Ephraimites as foreigners, unmasked by foreign accents, who, like the Ammonites, do not belong in the land that God had given instead to the Gileadites. Careful readers will recall the earlier story of Jephthah's negotiation with the Ammonites, a narrative the main focus of which was not to highlight Jephthah's supposed scholarship, but was intended instead to show that Yahweh had given specific tracts of land to Israel and that other nations had no right to them. In the negotiation, the Deuteronomist is reminding readers that Yahweh gave the Transjordan to the 2.5 tribes of Gilead, specifically to Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh, not to Ephraim. At the conclusion of the Jephthah story, however, the Ephraimites do indeed try to invade Gilead. The Deuteronomist has thus constructed a brilliant tale with the Jephthah story as a whole to draw this connection between Jephthah's foreign sacrifice and Ephraim's foreign morality, highlighting the disintegration of Israelite society and its leaders in the absence of a Yahweh-centric monarchy. In the end, from a Deuteronomistic point of view, there is no tragedy in the story of Jephthah. We have here the story of a man who rises to power, not by the hand of Yahweh, who has tired of Israel's repetitive backsliding and cries for help, but instead chosen to lead by the very people in distress. Their new so-called hero does not understand that a vow he makes to secure Yahweh's favor is not only unnecessary, but is in fact a bribe, and who, while worshiping Yahweh, nonetheless does so as a foreigner, in direct contradiction to the commands of the deity. Jephthah isn't a tragic figure, but a failure, another step in the long decline of Israel narrated in the book of Judges, whitewashing the tale so that it becomes merely the dedication of a child to indentured servitude in the Yahweh cult, or as a power play between an overindulgent father and a spoiled daughter, misses the whole point of the Jephthah story in the overall theme of Judges. Such apologetics serve a modern purpose, but completely ignore the ancient context of the narrative. It may make a feminist amateur Bible student feel better to imagine the daughter of Jephthah as a spoiled brat, twirling her doting father around her finger like a wad of gum, but that hardly does justice to the story in the wider theme of the book of Judges and the history of how the text was constructed and why. It may make Christian readers feel better to think of Jephthah's daughter as some sort of perpetual virgin, like Mary, mother of Jesus, in service to Yahweh and celebrated by the women of Israel, but again that ignores the deep and somber theme of Judges, with the Jephthah story as one of its most poignant and shocking examples. There's only one loose end yet to tie off in our examination of the Jephthah story and how it fits the ancient context of the Hebrew Scriptures and not a modern Christian apologist's psychoanalysis of the tale. Why would the author of Hebrews include Jephthah in his list of faithful characters of the Old Testament as an example for other Christians to follow? We must first dispense with the idea that the book of Hebrews was written by Paul. It is an anonymous work, of which even the early church theologian Origen concluded God only knows its true author. It is an exhortation to follow Christ and have faith in the promise of salvation and the future resurrection. The people who are listed in the 11th chapter of the book are those from the Hebrew Scriptures who enjoyed at least some sort of notoriety among its readers and followers, and it has not been overlooked by scholars that the list is actually out of order. Samson is listed prior to Jephthah, but in the book of Judges actually comes afterwards. Gideon is listed before Barak, while Barak, in fact, was not even a judge. Why this odd listing? It may simply be that the author of Hebrews relied on a traditional summary of the period of the Judges, rather than having actually consulted the book itself. As noted by Harold Attridge in his commentary on the Epistle of the Hebrews, whatever his sources and rationale, the naming of these 6 figures serves primarily as a transition from the preceding pericope with its attention to individuals of the patriarchal and Exodus periods to the generically depicted later history of Israel. If we're allowed to speculate on the reason Jephthah was included in the list, despite his errant vow, however, it certainly was not because he followed through with his daughter's sacrifice. It was instead because, as the author notes, his faith, as misexecuted as it was, nonetheless caused his weakness to turn to strength, and gave him the power to go into battle and rout a foreign army. It may be, too, that the author of Hebrews simply didn't understand the role of Jephthah in the overall theme of the Deuteronomistic history. He was interpreting the ancient texts through a decidedly Christian lens, and, as later Christian apologists after him would do, misunderstood the Jephthah story. He included Jephthah in his list of faithful men of Israel's past, holding him up as an example for other Christians to follow, and his inclusion has caused fits for apologists ever since.
Onward, Christian soldiers, marching as to war. with the cross of Jesus going on before. Christ the royal master leads against the foe, forward into battle, see his banner go. Onward, Christian soldier.
But holding up men of questionable values isn't at all something unheard of in Christianity. While it perplexes some Christians how a man like Jephthah, so divorced from what are considered Christian values, could nonetheless be included in Hebrews' list of faithful men of Israel's past, and despite the fact that his inclusion has misdirected some short-sighted amateur apologists to psychoanalyze his and his daughter's motives, Jephthah's inclusion shouldn't really come as any surprise. Christians have often accepted into their ranks those of questionable moral character, as long as these figures in some way promote their own cause. As a case in point, the Values Voter Summit was created in 2006 to provide a forum to help inform and mobilize citizens across the United States to preserve what they believe are the bedrock values of traditional marriage, religious liberty, sanctity of life, and limited government, all values important to American evangelical Christians. Indeed, the summit has been sponsored by such conservative Christian organizations as the American Family Association Action, American Values, First Liberty Institute, Liberty University, Ohio Christian University, the Heritage Foundation, Family Research Council, the D. James Kennedy Center for Christian Statesmanship, and the National Religious Broadcasters. The group, when it met in October of 2017, featured President of the United States Donald Trump as a key speaker at the event, a man known for his salty language, brash demeanor, multiple marriages, and documented boasts of sexual belligerency.
She's still very beautiful.
I moved on her, actually. You know, she was down in Palm Beach. I moved on her, and I failed. I'll admit it.
Whoa.
I did try and fuck her. She was married.
That's huge news there.
No, Nancy.
Yeah.
No, this was marriages. And I moved on her very heavily. In fact, I took her out furniture shopping. I moved on her like a bitch. But I couldn't get there. And she was married. And all of a sudden, I see her. She's now got the big phony tits and everything. She's totally changed her look. You know, I'm automatically attracted to beautiful. I just start kissing them. It's like a magnet. You just kiss. I don't even know. And when you're a star, they let you do it. You can do anything.
Whatever you want.
Grab them by the pussy. You can do anything.
Maybe he's not as rich as people think. Not that it matters, but I'm much richer, and you'll see that next week. You see somebody getting ready to throw a tomato, knock the crap out of them, would you? Seriously. I promise you, I will pay for the legal fees. I'd like to punch him in the face, I'll tell you. I love the old days. You know what they used to do to guys like that when they were in a place like this? They'd be carried out on a stretcher, folks.
Despite these rather un-Christ-like traits, one attendee said of Mr. Trump, reflecting the views of many other evangelicals across the United States who voted for him, "He's not perfect, but his heart is in the right place. We believe him to be God's champion. God needed a fighter, someone who was unapologetic." But this isn't the only time a Christian found a champion in Mr. Trump.
What I was hearing the Lord say was, "This is my son, with whom I'm well pleased." The Lord was showing me how you, Mr. Trump, Donald, as a little boy and growing up, that you were a good son. You had a good father. The Lord is saying, "I'm your father. And I have prepared you for this time, for such a time as this. You have been groomed and prepared for this kind of battle. God has given you the backbone and the courage to say yes to this challenge." And I just want to go ahead. I know you want to add to this.
So like some American evangelicals, early Christians could easily have overlooked Jephthah's faults and still anointed him as God's champion, a fighter, not perfect, but with his heart in the right place, despite the sacrifice of his daughter. To list him as a man of faith in spite of his flaws really is not at all unusual in a Christian sense.
I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and I wouldn't lose any voters, okay? It's like incredible.